Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dave Bly. I'm a director at Alex Partners, the host of today's event. I'm proud to say that I'm also the newest board member of School Justice Project. As your host, I'd like to formally welcome you all to the Summer Summit, SJP's annual fundraiser involving a day of giving and today's virtual discussion. I hope you're all as excited as I am to watch our esteemed panelists to discuss the truly awe-inspiring work SJP does each day. Please feel free to leave a message on the comment wall, where you'll also find a link to our donation page. And with that, I'll turn it over to my fellow board member, Christy Weisner.
Thanks, Dave, and hello, everyone. We're so grateful for your support today, and I'd like to especially thank this event's sponsors, whose support is incredibly impactful to an organization like SJP. In particular, thank you to our host, Alex Partners, our platinum sponsors, the Russo-Thompson family and Halo Top International, our gold sponsors, Arnold & Porter and Mountain Shore Properties, and our bronze sponsors, One Huddle and Nixon Peabody. Please check out the SJP website to learn more about this incredible team of supporters. Now let's get to our panel. We are thrilled to be joined today by Cheryl Dorsey as moderator. Cheryl is the president of Echoing Green and the first Echoing Green Fellow to lead the organization, having received a fellowship in 1992 to help launch the Family Van, a community-based mobile health unit in Boston. Echoing Green is a global nonprofit that supports emerging social entrepreneurs and invests deeply in their ideas and leadership. For example, Sarah Como and Claire Blumenson co-founded and launched School Justice Project in 2013, thanks to seed funding from Echoing Green's Black Male Achievement Fellowship. So when I tell you all about Cheryl, you're going to understand why we are so honored to have her join us for this discussion. In addition to her social entrepreneur background, Cheryl is an experienced leader, having served in 2 presidential administrations as a White House Fellow and Special Assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Labor, a Special Assistant to the Director of the Women's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor, and Vice Chair for the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. She serves on a diverse array of boards and speaks regularly on issues of racial justice and equity, and her awards and honors are too numerous to list. Also, she has a medical degree and a master's in public policy, both from Harvard. It's unreal. So thanks again, Cheryl, and I hand it over to you.
Christy, thank you for that lovely and far too kind introduction. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here with everyone today, and not only appreciate you, Christy, but also appreciate Alex Partners for hosting this really important conversation that I am thrilled and honored to be a part of. And before I bring in Claire and Teo for our conversation, I just want to follow up on a couple of things that Christy said about how I came to know the work that SJP is doing in Washington, D.C., groundbreaking work. And I'll brag for just a moment about SJP because I know that Claire and Teo are too busy doing the work to do so. Christy mentioned that the organization that I run, Echoing Green, is essentially a global social venture fund, and we really are one of the pioneers in the field of social innovation. And our job is really to go out around the world and find the leaders and ideas that are groundbreaking, paradigm shifting, innovative, disruptive. And we do that work through an annual global social business plan competition. And every year we get upwards of 3,000, 3,500 submissions from 160 countries around the world. And ultimately we select less than 1% to 2% of those who apply for investment. So when I came to know both Claire and Sarah, when they became 2013 Black Male Achievement Fellows, like Christy noted, it was after running an extraordinary gauntlet. So it matters that they are a part of the Echoing Green community, and it matters, and I'm quite proud to say that Claire and Sarah were part of the second class of our Black Male Achievement Fellowship program, which was founded with support from the Open Society Foundations to identify best-in-class leaders who were developing and deploying innovative solutions to improve the outcomes of men and boys of color in this country. And I think that really gives you a sense of how Claire, Sarah, Teo, the entire team is coming to this work. So Claire, I think I will start with you. And I'm so glad to see you again, even virtually. I would love for you to tell all of us more about School Justice Project's mission. But Claire, I want you to sort of do that with a twist and also tell us how you came to the work, what we at Echoing Green sort of talk about as your moment of obligation, what led you here and what has it led you and your colleagues to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you so much, Cheryl, for being here. It's such an honor to have you. So School Justice Project is a special education legal services nonprofit that specifically serves students ages 17 to 22, both while they're incarcerated and throughout the reentry process. And just to sort of step back a little bit and talk about, I know you asked sort of the moment of obligation, how I came into this work. So both my parents are public defenders, and I grew up really understanding sort of how important public interest law could be. But I also was interested in education, and as a former teacher, I sort of spent time really thinking through the intersection of education and the justice system, and what that looked like. And so after teaching, I went to law school specifically to focus on that intersection, but I didn't really know what it would look like until I did a fellowship at the DC Public Defender Service, specifically looking at special education law for this oldest student population. And when I was there working inside a juvenile detention facility as a special education lawyer for students ages 18 to 22, I met Sarah. And Sarah was looking at sort of conditions of confinement work and doing stuff more on the justice side. And I was acting as a special education lawyer in that detention facility. And what we saw really was alarming. We saw these incredible systemic barriers to education that continued to funnel young people into this sort of school to prison pipeline and into the deep end of it. And so that sort of moment of obligation really was understanding that there were so many young people ages 17 to 22, so this oldest population of students who could simultaneously be involved in the juvenile system, the criminal justice system, the child welfare system, but also had rights under federal special education law to education. But they weren't necessarily who came to mind when you thought of school to prison pipeline, because they were these older students. And so too often they were left out of the school to prison pipeline conversation. And there really weren't services for them or a whole lot of advocacy around sort of the education barriers that they were facing, which were complex and unique. So I would say that sort of was the key point in time where we realized there really weren't other organizations that were doing this work. And so we applied for the Echoing Green Fellowship, and somehow we ended up in the cohort. And we were just, honestly, this work has been so important, and still, 8 years later, there are still so few organizations that are specifically dedicated to this work that we see an enormous opportunity to make a difference here. So School Justice Project, again, we sort of achieve our mission using 3 different strategies: direct representation, where we represent individual clients; systemic advocacy and policy, where we try to tackle some of the systemic barriers that our clients have highlighted for us; and then community outreach and legal training, where we train judges, different stakeholders on how to integrate special education law into the juvenile and criminal practice.
Thank you for that really rich and deep discussion. And, for those who are listening, you can see why the work of SJP matters. And, those of us who traffic in the world of innovation, you're always thinking about where are the gaps, where are the market failures. And as you just shared, Claire, how you're working on the special education rights of, older students involved in the DC juvenile justice system. It is quite intersectional, right? It's not just about the legal system, but how their economic livelihood is impacted, how their educational rights are enforced. So appreciate what you do. And now, Teo, let me turn to you. So Claire and Christy are Wahoos. They got to know one another while they were in law school. You and I were Boston girls. You got your JD from Northeastern and went on to build a really extraordinary career working at the New York Civil Liberties Union. You served at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. You worked at the hallowed NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. and found your way with all of your prodigious legal training and skills to School Justice Project. But never in your wildest imagination did you think that you would be doing this work in the midst of both a global pandemic, Teo, and in a moment of racial reckoning that has rocked not just this country, but also the entire world. Can you talk about sort of not only the work, but how you have navigated it along with SJP in this, annus horribilis, this year like none other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Cheryl, for being here to moderate this conversation. Your resume speaks, volumes to the just your understanding of what we do here at SJP and how much faith you put in our organization. And Echoing Green has speaks volumes to the work that we're able to do on the ground. So. Yeah, I mean, my career has been a little bit of a windy one getting to this point, but as you mentioned, it all kind of culminated in my work as, training to be a civil rights attorney, and then really kind of honing in on education as being the primary focus of my work, and then kind of seeing, this year, this moment that we're living in right now, with all of the injustices that we're seeing across the board, particularly in the area of racial equity and mass incarceration, and obviously of recent the police killings that have become very viral. And as folks who serve predominantly young Black men, that's something that is particularly visceral in our work. This year has obviously, it's so overused the term, but it has been unprecedented. It has been, catastrophic to see what our clients are experiencing, not just in their pending court matters, not just in their special education and the denial of the rights that they are federally entitled to, but also what's happening in their lives. And, this pandemic has highlighted many of the injustices that were already underlying that, we of course all knew about, but just, folks just didn't seem to focus on. And, obviously the pandemic through a lot of the work that we've been doing lately has, also shown us, just how little focus there is on this particularly vulnerable population of older court-involved students when it comes to their education, especially for those kids that we work with that are just trying so hard, so desperately to enter a classroom, to have a teacher teach them, so that to be provided with related services such as counseling, to talk about the issues that they're dealing with. Because at the end of the day, we're still talking about kids. They're this emerging adult population, but they're kids. They're children who need our love and our support as adults who have been down this path. And SJP is there to do that as legal advocates, but also just in our compassion that we bring to our work.
Thank you for that. And you said so many important things, Teo, but I'm going to focus on, one word, love, right? And I've known Claire and Sarah for years, and I can't tell you sort of the time at Echoing Green conferences, walking the dog with Claire, getting the text from Claire about your clients, right? Their stories, your fierce, not only your fierce competence and commitment to the work, but the fierce nature of your love and regard for these young people. Claire, tell us, again, we don't need names or, identifying information, but tell us more about these amazing young people that you've worked with and that you hold so dear.
Yeah, I mean, so we're working with young people who have faced so many systemic barriers, but who are fighting so hard to get their education. And I think one of the sort of most striking things that has happened is often people say, oh, well, working with the 17, 18, 19-year-olds, like, that must be really difficult. Do they really want to go back to school? So I'd like to just start by saying the answer was a resounding yes. And what we found was, so special education rights inure to the student at age 18, right? So before they or the parents, but at age 18, they go to the student. So like from a starting point, our clients are all retaining special education lawyers so that they can go back to school. So if you think of that as sort of like a measure of interest, right, or a measure of commitment, I mean, that right there is huge. So they are seeking out free special education lawyers to make sure that they can get back into school. And that's, to us, like that's just sort of the starting point, right? But we see that our work can sort of help with clients learning the self-advocacy tools to be able to empower themselves and advocate without an attorney in the future. So a lot of our work isn't sort of just about the school piece. It's about sort of building advocacy skills and making sure that young people are empowered with those tools. So I just to maybe put a little bit of context in this, like what are some of the systemic areas that our clients are facing? So there are two really critical ones that struck me like right from the beginning of this work. So the first is being able to secure and transfer credits for courses that students complete. So one of the things I was most struck by when I started doing this work was that students who are involved in the justice system, it's a very transient population, right? So they can be sent to various facilities. In DC, they're sent to facilities all over the country. And they are sent there, by, for example, the Juvenile Justice Agency, sent there for rehabilitation. And so after years in different facilities where they're placed by the DC government agency, they often were coming home to find out that their school credits didn't count. So just like taking a moment to think that through. I mean, imagine getting A's and B's, for years after being sent to placements by a DC government agency, only to find out when you think you're a senior graduating from high school that you're actually going to be a freshman. That none of those classes count because a different DC government agency says, English 1 in Iowa isn't going to count for English 1 in DC. I mean, that is so, it's not even my life. And I find it just so infuriating that it drives me totally crazy. And 8 years later, it's still an enormous problem. So it was not a matter of, at first when we started, I thought, oh, maybe people just don't know, or maybe this is an agency communication issue. So that's not it. And that this is just, one more sort of way where young people who are involved in the court systems are being prevented from a path to high school graduation. And just to be clear on who we're talking about, 98% of our clients are Black, 2% Latinx, and that's the same, those demographic breakdowns are the same for the rest of the DYRS committed population. So this is, entire generations of young Black men who are being prevented by the government, being prevented from graduating from high school and being able to engage in post-secondary education, employment, civic engagement. So this is really a crisis. And the second area, so credits is one of the biggest systemic issues that we saw. And every young person's experience is unique, right? But there are similar sort of like consistent threads that go throughout, right? And the credits issue was one of them. And the other issue that we saw was education during incarceration. And so, a sort of broader explanation of this is basically that like when young people are inside secure facilities or detention facilities or long-term secure facilities, they're just not receiving the special education services that they need and that they're entitled to under law. But the law doesn't change. They're still entitled to these services and they're not receiving them. And in the sort of general community, about 15 to 20% of students have special education needs. But in the secure facilities, if you look at like who the DYRS committed population is, 80 to 90% have special education needs.
Wow.
So, I mean, this is who we're talking about. And, what should happen is that you're actually getting better services inside facilities, right? You're getting, more special education services, better, just better everything, right? But instead, unfortunately, it's either nothing or worse services. And I know Teo will talk about that in a moment. So again, the two issues that we've really focused on are the credits issue and then education inside facilities. And through our work, we see, special education legal services as simultaneously increasing educational equity and reducing the use of mass incarceration. And through that, we feel like, we can work towards racial justice and a more equitable community by tackling these two issues simultaneously. And so again, what we're trying to do is both increase the education attainment for students and also their access to special education rights, but also make sure that they can be educated in the community.
Well, beautifully said. Thank you for walking us through that, Claire. And I remember so vividly back in 2018 being so proud when SJP and one of your clients brought a federal complaint against the Bureau of Prisons in DC for failing to provide, as you said, special education and a path to a high school diploma. And you all succeeded. And for it was the first time that a federal court has held that DC remains responsible for providing special education under the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to residents who are in federal facilities. And I didn't understand all of the detail in the way that you lawyers do, but I was like, wow, this is a big deal. This is a BFD, as the kids say. So I was incredibly proud of what you all are doing. And I know that continues, Teo, because I know that you recently filed a class action lawsuit. And can you share that with us, what it is, why you filed it, and just give us an update?
Yeah, absolutely, Cheryl. So, at the beginning of the pandemic, understandably, school districts across the country, probably across the world, really didn't know what to do, how to respond, how to adequately serve young people. It was the end of the school year, and for safety's sake, everyone, for the most part, went into a virtual learning environment. That's to be expected. That makes complete and perfect sense. However, the situation here in DC was a little different for those who were securely detained. So for students at the school located at the DC jail, which is called the Inspiring Youth Program, IYP, as we call it, those students who are at a jail, so they are detained, so they have not yet necessarily been convicted of a crime, but they're securely detained at the jail and supposed to be receiving the educational services that are listed on their IEP because they have special education needs that have been identified, and they're supposed to receive the typical classes that they would receive there, as well as their related services, like I mentioned before, counseling, speech therapy, etc. However, those students did not receive that at all. So instead, what happened was, first, there was a massive delay in any kind of provision of education at all. And then when the education did resume according to the DC public school system, it was through work packets. So students were given a manila envelope with several packets of information. So complicated packets. I mean, we're talking about high school students. So things like physics and, probability and statistics packets, Spanish packets that were handed to them in a folder with no instruction, no individualized or support or embedded accommodations or anything that would have been something that they were entitled to under their IEPs to at least try to help them navigate these very complicated topics on their own. So students were given these packets that were not given any instruction whatsoever. So there were no teachers, for the most part, entering the facility to take students either out of class to provide instruction in either individual or small groups or whatever made sense for safety considerations. Nor, and here's the part that really rubs, I think, nor were they given any remote instruction. Instead, the facility and the DCPS said that they essentially weren't able to provide any type of distance learning via tablet as students were receiving throughout the community because of various excuses that I won't get into at this point. But we at SJP, this obviously was something that was brought to our attention extremely early, as we have a number of students who are incarcerated at the jail. And so we started sending emails to the folks who work at DCPS and ask them, what's happening? What's going on? We understand there's a pandemic. We're not really expecting teachers to go in person. We get that. We're remote. We understand safety considerations. But why aren't the students receiving tablets so that they can receive instruction remotely? And we kept asking these questions, Cheryl, time and time again, throughout the spring, throughout the summer, until finally at the end of August, we decided to send a demand letter to the chancellor and also the superintendent of the Office of the Superintendent of Education, State Superintendent of Education, OSSI, saying, this is in violation of federal law. This is in violation of the IDEA. It's in violation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Frankly, it's in violation of Section 2, Title 2 of the ADA and DC Human Rights Act law, right? I mean, we are concerned that OSSI is not properly monitoring DCPS as it's supposed to, as the state education agency, to ensure that the public school system is providing a FAPE for these students. And DCPS, as the LEA, is not providing an education. They're not going into the facility either, in person or remotely, and they're not providing any of these related services that these students critically need. Add to that, Cheryl, that the DC jail had decided to go on a 23-1, which is a short-term way of saying the students were incarcerated in their cells for 23 hours a day, and they were only allowed out for 1 hour each day. And during that 1 hour each day, they were expected to shower, make calls to their attorneys, make calls to their families. If they, needed anything, to talk to the correctional officers and say, I need something else for my cell just for my basic survival, right? I mean, these were extremely harsh conditions that the students were living in and continue to live in. So, we continued reaching out to the school system. The school system made no changes. So then we were forced to file what's called a due process complaint to, in effect, effectuate their rights through the administrative process. We went to an administrative hearing, which is basically like a truncated trial. You do openings and closings, et cetera. And then we won. In January, the hearing officer found that DCPS was, in fact, not providing our client with a FAPE, with the special education rights that they're entitled to. The hearing officer demanded or required for the school district to start putting services into effect for the student, and to meet with OSSI to discuss, any OSSI and the Department of Corrections, the actual jail, to discuss any complications that were arising that would have led to this, this problem. And that actually made sense because there is already an existing memorandum of understanding, an MOA, that SJP helped create years ago that was supposed to govern any disputes that arise or any issues that arise between those three entities: the public school system, the state, the office of the OSSI, the state education agency, so basically the one level up above the public school system, as well as the jail. And yet there was no communication, it seems, between those three agencies to ensure that students were receiving instruction in the way that they are required to under not only federal guidance during the pandemic time issued by the United States Department of Education, but also OSSI's own guidance that said that every student who was entitled to special education instruction services should receive it during the pandemic to the greatest extent possible, and said the kids were just receiving nothing. So fast forward, we again kept talking to the school district. We filed more due process complaints and said, okay, well, let's keep working these out on an individual basis. And yet DCPS refused to put in place any type of formal instruction methodology for the students. So in mid-April, we decided to file a class action lawsuit against DC. We alleged that they had violated the laws that I previously spoke about: IDEA, Section 504, ADA, and the DC Human Rights Law. And now we're in the process of litigating that case. We are trying to seek a preliminary injunction from the federal court at this moment to try to get DCPS to do what it needs to do and just provide an education to these students. And as Claire said, and I don't think it can be said enough, we're talking about, older students who are detained, in this particular population, who are saying, just give me school.
Right.
Like, just give me school.
Right.
I want my time served to mean something. I want to come out of this facility or the next, if that's going to be the case, to matter for something, so that I can come back, I can start a life, I can, have access to a job or post-secondary opportunities, vocational opportunities, whatever that might be, but just give me school. That's all they're asking for. And the fact that, we had to bring a class action lawsuit in order to enforce those rights is reprehensible, frankly. But, we hope that, and, we feel very strong on the law. So, we hope that we see a positive result through this lawsuit. But it shouldn't have taken a lawsuit. It shouldn't have taken DCPS this long to do what they needed to do. But we certainly hope for success in our arguments. So yes, we're plugging away at that.
You are plugging away, and thank you for, again, sort of the ferocity of your commitment. And SJP really has sort of created this field of work, and it's extraordinary but reprehensible, that is required for these young people. So I appreciate all that you do, and I'm sure we'll all look forward to seeing the outcome of that case. And we are short on time, but before I turn it back to Claire, I want to ask you one more thing, and sort of a follow-up, Teo, to you walking us through sort of the current case and how you're working and sort of the system you all are bumping up against every single day. In this moment, 1 year after the murder of Mr. Floyd, there's been a lot of talk about allyship. What does meaningful allyship look like? And it sometimes defaults to a fairly performative conversation, but let's get into it. What does meaningful allyship look like? A lot of DC law firms work with you all, look to you all. Teo, what would you say to someone who really does want to show up in allyship? How would you advise her to do so?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many opportunities. I think both, just working with SJP and working outside of SJP. Allyship to me is, there's a myriad of ways that people can show up, such as, volunteering with a local nonprofit such as ours to provide pro bono legal services if somebody has the ability to do that and the skill set to do that. Allyship looks like, showing up to provide mentorship to young people. If, let's say, we're talking about a non-lawyer capacity. Allyship looks like, frankly, making donations to organizations.
Yep, good one.
That's for our board. To enable us to do this work that is so critical. Allyship takes a lot of forms, especially in this time when many of us feel, safest at home and not able to really go out and engage with our community. Allyship could be joining conversations that we're having district-wide about the role of police in our communities. It's one thing to see something horrific on the news and, explain privately to your family and maybe friends that you're horrified by what you saw. It's another to, join the conversation, join it on social media, do what you can, use your skill set, whatever that might look like, to help launch a social media campaign of a advocacy organization, a grassroots organization, to volunteer your time in other ways. Allyship can mean just about anything. Frankly, whatever your skills are, whatever, passion and dedication that you have to this moment in time, you just have to choose a place and it's already doing the work and engage. Mutual aid funds, donating to that, providing some waters. I mean, there's
That's
so many
beautifully
different
said.
ways.
Yep. Well said, Teo. That's an invitation. Join how you can, when you can, whenever you can. It's beautiful. Claire, bring us to a close of this really rich conversation. I mean, you, Sarah, you're visionaries, you're innovators, and you're in the work, but as sort of all forward-thinking leaders, you're always looking into the future. Tell us some of the key initiatives you're working on and how that's sort of lining up and stacking up for where SJP is going, and where do you see yourself in the next 5 or so years?
Absolutely. So we do have 2 exciting pieces of legislation that I think sort of leads into the scale conversation. So in DC, we have one piece of legislation that should be reintroduced soon on the credits issue, which I talked about earlier. But I think that will be really exciting and in many ways sort of groundbreaking legislation on this issue that could then be scaled to other jurisdictions. But another piece of legislation, which I really want to highlight, was introduced in February. And it's legislation to help create a special education attorney panel for young people in criminal court. And why that matters, so, we've talked about why access to special education legal services can be so important, but it's particularly important in the court context. And it's something that generally, unless you have a lot of money for, you wouldn't be able to get a special education attorney. And that's particularly true for this 18 to 22-year-old population of young people. And so while DC does have a special education attorney panel that operates in family court, again, that just sort of exemplifies this gap where even though 18 to 22-year-olds still have special education rights, they would actually not be in family court. And so because the special education attorneys are appointed through family court, they are left out. And so this legislation would create a special education attorney panel in criminal court. And that way, like to put it crudely, it would create sort of a market for private special education attorneys to represent young people who wouldn't be able to pay for it because they'd be paid through the court system. And so right now, School Justice Project is one of the only organizations that does this. The Public Defender Service also does sort of integrate special education law into the court context, but this would open that up to any special education lawyer in DC. And we believe that is just sort of the critical example of how we would be able to take scale at a systemic level to other jurisdictions, because we're operating, again, under a federal special education law. So while things might, there are certain things that are different in DC, really this issue is a national issue. And this issue can be, a large part of the solution can be special education legal services across the country. We think there's something like over 200,000 young people at this very moment who would benefit from having special education attorneys in their case. And right now, no other organization is doing that. And so we're really excited about this legislation. We're hoping it will pass this year. And we've been working very hard to get it introduced, to get it out there. And we are hoping that once this passes, we can work with other jurisdictions to get this implemented, in their localities. And that sort of talks to our larger scale plan. So Cheryl, as you know, when we started School Justice Project, we were thinking, scale could be wherever, we'll just replicate everywhere. And like within 3 months, Sarah and I'm like, that is not going to be a feasible plan. And so for us, what scale means, we're going to build out our team a little bit. Right now, we're a team of 5. We're hoping to become a team of 6 this year, but then building out our sort of local special education attorney staff, somewhat. But sort of in terms of larger impact, instead of scaling through replication, now we want to scale through technical assistance and training models. So that can be a relatively low lift where we will go to other jurisdictions that are interested in sort of seeing how special education law can be used in the court context, and then work with them to put things in place. And we actually had a really good experience sort of testing that theory out with Louisville, Kentucky, where Teo and I spent a lot of time sort of working through how can School Justice Project be useful to you. And we ended up finding that, yes, there were a lot of things that could actually be useful in those jurisdictions, including things like cross-sector collaboration efforts and the court education work group, which Teo right now co-chairs. And so they were able to actually put in place in Louisville a court education work group that would bring together all the stakeholders and address certain education issues that were specifically affecting court-involved students. And so, that I could talk about this for like another half hour, so I'll stop there. But all of that is to say that we do see some real opportunity that will not be expensive to do, but that would actually really expand our impact by scaling at both the individual level, so showing attorneys special education attorneys in those jurisdictions, how to partner with defense attorneys to seek alternatives to incarceration, which again is how we contribute to reducing mass incarceration while also ensuring the substantive education rights are enforced. So that, and then also at the systems level through like cross-sector collaboration efforts, legislation efforts like the 2 pieces of legislation here, and more. So, we have a lot of things ahead. We're really excited. And we think that special education legal services can truly make a difference to build a more equitable community.
Wow, that is big, bold, and audacious, and I would expect nothing else from you all at SJP. In listening to both of you, Claire and Teo, I'm reminded, Echoing Green, everybody thinks we're an environmental organization, but we're not. The name comes from a poet named William Blake, who was a poet, printer, and painter, but also a real iconoclast. And one of his most famous quotes is, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create." And that's what SJP has done. You have built out this body of law and practice that has created a pathway for others to follow in your wake. And your work has never been more important. And as we come to a close, I want to thank both of you all for being such extraordinary examples of leaders, advocates, fiercely committed folks to young people, youth advocates. And, you know, in this moment, especially in this year of racial reckoning and sort of massive disruption, people do come to Echoing Green and say, well, what can I do? And as Teo said, give money and give more of it, give it at a meaningful level, and give it flexibly, right? You just heard from these extraordinary lawyers and leaders. Let them do what they do. They know what they're doing. We just got to get out of their way and let them go forward. So I do hope you all are as inspired as I was to be in conversation with these amazing advocates and leaders. And please support their work. It is really, really important. And if you want to know more, just go to sjpdc.org and you can find out more about all the extraordinary things that you're doing. But ladies, appreciate you. Am humbled and honored to be in conversation with you. You are doing amazing stuff. You're amazing. Thank you.
Thank
you so much, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I think with that, thank you all for joining and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.